All right, so you're diving into the Call of the Wild this time. It's an adventure, sure, but what gets me is how a story this old, over a century, can still feel so relevant today. We're
Yeah.
using this podcast episode someone did summarizing the book, and I think if we kind of dig into it together,
Uh-huh.
we can figure out why it still speaks to people, over 100 years later.
It's a good question. It really is. And part of the answer, I think, is in understanding the world that Jack London built in the book.
Yeah.
He just throws you right into this Klondike Gold Rush thing. And it wasn't just like setting the scene. It was like the whole point almost. Like imagine all that ambition. Everyone wants the gold
Right.
and the just terrible conditions. And it's a place where like being civilized could just disappear.
Yeah, the podcast really made that clear. It was brutal.
It really
It
was.
wasn't just like, oh, we're going to find gold and get rich. It was like, can we even survive this?
Exactly. And all this is happening right when Darwin's ideas were getting popular.
Oh,
Survival of the fittest, yeah. And it's the ones who fit in best, they make it. It was a big deal back then. And you can like feel that idea and all the struggles Buck goes through and even the choices that people make. It's all around them.
you think London was doing that on purpose, making people think about their own comfy lives and how they
Yeah.
fit into, nature and all that survival stuff?
It's just something to think about. London, he lived through that Klondike winter himself, and he wrote the whole book in just 30 days. So all that stuff about the Yukon, the landscape, the sledding, that's not just him reading about it. He lived it. He put it right onto the page.
30 days. Wow.
Yeah.
That's like pure inspiration just flowing out.
Yeah, yeah.
So that brings us to Buck, our main character, the dog. He starts off pretty pampered, right? Living the good life in California. What mix was he again?
St. Bernard and Scotch Collie, yeah.
Okay, so like house pet, totally spoiled, and then bam, Yukon wilderness.
Exactly. Things change fast. He ends up in the wild, and it's adapt or die, no in between.
So we got this pampered pup thrown into a Darwinian fight for survival. Intense. What were some of the moments in that transformation that really stood out to you from the podcast? Like, how did he change?
So many. But the one that gets me is his fight with Spitz. He's the lead dog, the top dog.
Hey.
And it's a nasty fight. And it shows you something wild in Buck, something maybe even he didn't know was there.
Yeah. And you mentioned Darwin before. Is this fight just straight up survival of the fittest, or is there more? Like, is London saying something about being a leader or how packs work, dog packs?
Ooh, good point. Yeah, there's definitely the brute strength part. But Buck's also clever in the fight. He uses his head.
Right.
It's not just being strong, it's being smart, knowing how the pack works, the whole hierarchy.
No, that is interesting. And we see it all from Buck's point of view. That's the whole book, right?
Yeah, London decided to tell it from the dog's perspective.
Which is such a cool choice. It makes you see the world and feel nature in this totally different way. Like raw, instinctual. We're not just watching Buck, we're kind of in his head.
Exactly.
And then there's John Thornton. He's one of the gold guys. And he and Buck have this bond that's just so strong, especially compared to all the harsh stuff around them.
Right?
Did that, the human-animal connection, did that stand out to you in the podcast too?
Oh, totally. It's like Thornton sees this special something in Buck, this spirit that won't break. And Buck, he finds a kind of love and loyalty in Thornton that he's never had before.
Yeah.
It makes you think about how deep those bonds can go between different species even. How it can be more than what society expects.
Yeah. It really does make you wonder, like, what's important to us in those relationships? Do we want to, like, control things or actually understand? I think that's a big part of what London was getting at in The Call of the Wild.
And maybe that's the reason this story still grabs us today. We talked about the history, the survival stuff.
But there's more to it than that, right?
Yeah.
Like, freedom, it's not just Buck getting away, physically escaping.
All right.
It's deeper, yeah.
Oh, yeah, definitely. As he becomes less tame, less like a pet, he's also leaving behind all the rules of human society, how he's supposed to be. He's embracing the wild part of himself, and that makes us think about what civilized even means versus being wild. Like, where's the line?
So he's asking us, where's the real freedom? Is it following society's rules, or is it something deeper, something inside us, like instinct?
And that question, it might be even more important now than it was back then. Think about how much our lives are all about rules, schedules, what people expect from us. Are we really free, or are we just on a different kind of leash?
Whoa. That's kind of creepy when you put it like that.
Yeah.
You said earlier London lived through that Klondike winter himself. Do you think, like, maybe he was attracted to that place because it was free in a way his own life wasn't?
It's possible the Yukon was like all that society stuff just stripped away.
Yeah.
You lived or died based on how well you adapted, if you trusted your gut, tapped into this like primal strength that maybe we all have somewhere inside.
That primal strength, that survival instinct. It's like the main theme running through the whole book. But you said before, it wasn't just about being the strongest, the toughest.
Right.
There's cooperation, too, like when Buck's on the sled team.
Exactly. It's not enough to be the strongest or fastest. To survive out there, you got to work together, depend on others, trust your pack. You can't do it alone.
So maybe Lennon is saying, like, survival of the fittest. It's not just about individual strength. It's about connecting with others, working as a group, finding strength in the community.
And that's huge for us today, isn't it? Think about all the problems we got. Climate stuff, people divided, politics a mess. You can't fix that alone. We got to find common ground, work together, or it's not even surviving. It's just, going down together.
That's deep, man.
Yeah.
And it kind of brings us back to that human-animal bond we were talking about, Buck and John Thornton. That relationship, it's not just a nice little side story. It's part of how Buck survives, how he grows, how he figures himself out.
Such a good point. Thornton doesn't try to break Buck, force him to obey. He respects that wildness, those instincts. And because they respect each other, they get this amazing bond, teaches them both about loyalty, trust, maybe even love.
Makes you think what London was saying about how we treat animals.
Yeah.
Was he, like, ahead of his time? Seeing how smart they are, that they have feelings, that they matter?
Could be. Back then, animals were mostly seen as property, like tools. But London, he gives us Buck's thoughts, his feelings. It's like looking inside him.
Yeah.
And maybe by doing that, he started something new, a way of understanding animals that's more kind, more respectful.
That's a powerful legacy, changing how we see things. It's part of why the Call of the Wild is still around, still important. It's not just a story. It's like a starting point for a whole conversation. It makes us think about where we fit in, question what we believe, see that everything's connected, all living things.
It's a lot to think about, and it really makes you see this book differently, doesn't it? We talked history, survival, freedom, that human-animal bond. But there's one thing we haven't gotten to yet. What's the impact been? How has this book lasted so long?
Yeah, good point.
The Call of the Wild, its influence, like everything, books, movies, even just how we think about what wild even means. That's a big deal.
Yeah, it's wild to think a book from 1903 is still making people think and talk today. And not just us, like you said, it's in other stuff too, right?
For sure. It's like all those adventure stories that came after, they owe something to the Call of the Wild. Books, movies, it's everywhere.
Even the podcast we're using for this, it mentioned all the moody versions. Seems like every generation wants to see Buck's story up on the big screen.
Yeah, and each one adds a little something different, right? Shows what was important back then, what people were worried about. It means the story can change with the times, but the main stuff, survival, freedom, our connection to nature, that never gets old.
We talk about how London changed how people saw animals, through his writing. What do you think he'd say about how the Call of the Wild is still shaping how we see that human-animal bond today?
I think he'd be happy seeing how his work helped people realize that animals are smart, they have feelings. It wasn't just a story. It was like him saying, hey, we got to have empathy. We're all connected, all living things.
And that message, it feels even more important now, don't you think? With climate change, animals losing their homes, all the debates about how we treat them, we got to understand how connected we are, or else.
Absolutely. The Call of the Wild, it makes us look at ourselves, our place in nature. Are we taking care of things or just using them up? That's a question we still haven't figured out.
Okay, so we're wrapping up our deep dive here. What's the one thing you hope our listener takes away from all this?
I think the biggest thing is the Call of the Wild isn't just an exciting adventure. It's like it shows us ourselves, our hopes, our fears, what we could be. It reminds us that even though the world's different now, those big questions, who are we, where do we belong, what about that wild part inside us and out in the world, those questions matter just as much today.
And that's why it still feels important.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just Buck's journey, it's ours too. It's like there's this call of the wild inside each of us, and we got to decide if we're brave enough to answer it.